Is it possible to win a war simply by not losing it? Today, we unpack what that means. And my guest makes the claim that we are witnessing the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution occurring on today's modern battleground. I asked him to elaborate, and he does. This is a fascinating conversation with Peter Zeihan, geopolitical analyst and author of The End of the World is Just the Beginning, right here on The Jay Martin Show. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Peter Zeihan. Peter, it's great to have you back on the show. I'm looking forward to this. All right, so we're gonna discuss a lot today. We're gonna unpack the Middle East. I want to get your thoughts on a handful of current events, statements, and predictions. But before we get into that, just to set the stage, I want your honest opinion on what the original intention was from the United States in this region. And do you think that intention has changed as the situation has evolved? What's your take?
Okay. The first thing we need to establish is there is no new United States policy here. This is entirely one person, Donald Trump. When Trump was in office his first term, every time somebody from the national security field would come in to brief him, he felt like he wasn't the smartest person in the room. And so his solution when he was out of power was to gut the Republican Party of its policy arm. So no one could ever be smarter than him on anything. And then when he came with second term, he fired the top 6,000 people in the civil service, and particularly deeply in, say, like the Russian branch of intelligence. So there is very little information being generated at any level within the federal government, and almost none of that is making it up to the White House. And what little does make it goes through Tulsi Gabbard, who is unofficially a Russian plant. So Trump is making decisions with poor to no information based on what he feels. And we're seeing that in any number of fields, whether it deals with medicine or foreign affairs or economics or tariffs or whatever it happens to be. Just in this case, there's shooting going on. So the best understanding from the people I've spoken with in the White House is that Trump, after the Maduro event, was like, oh, well, now we'll do Iran. And that's all the planning that went into it. The people who would have advised the president on how to fight a war in the Middle East are gone. The people who study energy markets, so know about the importance of Hormuz, are gone. And so we keep seeing Trump saying, nobody knew that this was going to happen. Well, actually, lots of people knew that was going to happen, and you fired all of them. So whenever you're evaluating a theory or a plan or an event, you have to keep in mind the only thing that matters is how it filters through his brain. And there's no one functionally to help him with that anymore, except for maybe the Joint Chief of Staff, General Kane. But General Kane is mostly going to be concerned, obviously, with operational concerns.
So then let me ask you, that's interesting. And on the surface, that is how it looks. A lot of the policies and actions seem to be the dictation of one individual, which strikes me as odd and surprising. But he also ran on a campaign which seemed like pretty great political instinct to say, it is my core focus to avoid any more forever ambiguous ending wars, right? And that was the same guy. So what do you think changed with him? Was it just the sort of like the winning streak after Venezuela? What's your take? And what was there for his intention, I guess, if not the American policy?
I mean, here's the thing. Anyone who thinks that Donald Trump is capable of consistency really hasn't been paying attention the last 15 years. His ability to make a decision off the cuff is powerful, and his ability to carry the room charismatically is powerful. But there hasn't, with the exception of we're being cheated by our allies and trade is bad, there's been very little consistency on any of his policies. And this is no exception to that. Bottom line, in round one, Trump won. He was surrounded by military advisors who were constantly drilling into him that anytime you start pulling triggers, there's going to be consequences. And there's an array of consequences and an array of people that can help prepare you for those consequences. Without those people around, the discussion just doesn't happen. The person, of course, who was closest to the events is Secretary Hegseth, who bragged at his confirmation hearing that he would be the least qualified defense secretary in American history. And here we are.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the common narratives that I hear, Peter, is that President Trump might have had these anti-war ambitions, but once you're in the seat, you're subject to all kinds of deeper forces, the unelected intelligence departments, maybe the intentions of your advisors like Rubio or Hegseth. And, you know, it's more difficult to execute on your personal agenda once you have to face all the influences around you in the Oval Office.
I'm going to call utter bullshit on that theory. It's never been true. The branch of the U.S. government that has most been consistently anti-conflict has been the military, because they understand the costs of a conflict. Now, once the military is deployed, the operation does take on a life of its own, because they're like, okay, what's the goal? We have to hit that goal. We can't leave until we hit that goal. We don't have a goal for this one. Now, in the war on terror, that absolutely worked against us on Afghanistan. We probably stayed there 12 years longer than we needed to, so there's some credence there. But like the intelligence services, their job is to help the president make a decision, give him whatever he needs for that. If you're concerned about the CIA pulling triggers, they have a special forces branch that operates independent of war. Their interests, if that's how you're viewing things, are in a completely different bucket. And all of that ultimately has to be approved by the director, who reports directly to the president. In fact, even during Trump 1, Trump stepped back from approving or disproving assassination programs, for example. So, sorry, let's go back here. During Obama, that's when the Predator and the Reapers really got good at targeting individuals. Mm-hmm. And Obama, constitutional law guy, insisted that he sign off personally on each individual strike, which, you know, I would argue the president has more important things to do. But Obama refused to have conversations with people about setting up an institution to manage this, so it only went through him. So when we got to Trump 1, the first time the CIA brought him an assassination program, he's like, why are you bringing this to me? Just do it. And he just stepped back. And so now, 10 years later, the CIA kind of has free reign when it feels that it needs to do something, and it doesn't even go up to the White House. It doesn't really go to anyone except for their own institution. That's a separate problem. In this current situation, we know very clearly that General Kane argued very strongly against this conflict, and Rubio was barely in the room. This was just Trump.
Okay. What do you think is the best case scenario for the Americans right now?
Well, let me outline where we are now, because I'm not sure best case is or even worst case is the way to phrase it.
Okay.
The nuclear program in Iran has been under development for 30 years. And for the last 15, 20 years, U.S. intelligence has been warning everybody that the Iranians are 6 months away from having a bomb. This is 1940s technology. The only way you stay 6 months away from having a bomb for 20 years is if you make a choice to stay 6 months away from having a bomb. Pakistan did it, India did it, North Korea did it. There are a number of allies, including Sweden, South Korea, that could do it very easily if they wanted to do it. This is not hard science or hard manufacturing, and Iran is sophisticated enough to do it. But they made the decision, the Iranian government made the decision, that if we develop a nuke, we will be attacked. So for us, the program to develop the nuke is our actual deterrent. And then last June, Israel and the United States attacked anyway. And they're like, maybe the only deterrent is an actual deterrent. And even if they didn't believe that last July, they certainly believe that now. So what the Trump administration has done has locked Iran into a program where now they will develop a nuke at their first opportunity. And that constrains American decision-making long-term in a way that we haven't faced since the Soviet Union fell. Because now we have a hostile state that views it as in their own best interest to hold a nuclear threat over the United States. And we're not ready for that. And the only way at this point to prevent that from happening is to not stop the war so that they never get a breath to try to do the work.
So Iran was strategically not an imminent threat by design. They developed
as long as you're using the word imminent, yes. These are not nice people. I'm not trying to make apologies here.
All good. No, I'm with you. I got it. So strategically 6 months away. So close enough to maybe rush a program if we feel that we need to, but not close enough to present a near-term imminent threat to anybody globally. That was the goal. That's what Pakistan did.
That was their logic.
That was their logic. And it worked for a period of time. It seemed like it worked for 30, 40 years until June. And then we bombed the facilities, Fodor. And the message that came home after that attack, Peter, was that we've decimated their facilities and they are decades away from any kind of a rebuild. Yet 6 months later, there's suddenly an imminent threat. That's the narrative. Both of those situations, would you loop them into the same kind of individual policy, as in one person policy? And what was the purpose behind the first attack, therefore?
Well, again, everyone in the military and the intelligence community who could get a voice into the Trump administration said that hitting a few facilities isn't going to take it out. They have 50 different nuclear facilities that we are aware of. They are all hardened, and there are undoubtedly ones that we don't know about. And also, they've got a nuclear power plant at Bushwir, so they could go the plutonium route fairly easily. That requires significantly less supporting infrastructure. When the attack happened, the Israelis made the case, Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, made the case to Donald Trump personally, saying that this will be really easy. We can do it with one phase. All your predecessors were weak and pointless, and you're the only strong president America has ever had, so let's do it. And they did it. And 3 days later, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which was a part of the intel system that, to be perfectly blunt, Trump didn't know exist, said that it had very low confidence that this would push anything back by more than a few months. And so, of course, those analysts were immediately fired.
Got it. Okay. So the big shift that's occurred, therefore, is that the strategy was to be 6 months away from an imminent threat, not close enough to be dangerous, but close enough if we need to. That situation is now, we need to be an imminent threat. That's the only way we are safe, is that we need to finish this process so that we can pull the trigger if we need to.
Yeah, and the best part is like the people who have been killed in the Iranian government, most notably the supreme leader, Khamenei. By Iranian standards, he was a moderate. So We've now gotten rid of the ones that were at least willing to speak with the United States, and they've been replaced with ones who are less enthusiastic about that option.
Well, I guess Khamenei would have been the guy who decided to stay 6 months away from danger for so long. He's gone. So walk us through that a little bit, because it's you put out a few videos breaking down, call it the Iranian power structure, how the clerical class relates to the IRGC and how this functions and what it would actually take to achieve regime change. Peter, obviously overthrowing one guy isn't going to do it because there's a whole organization that controls the guns and the money, being the IRGC. And from my perspective, their income's gone up by quite a lot. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Iran's exporting more oil at double the price than it was 6 months ago. So what do people need to understand about the power structures in Iran before they can just throw a dart at regime change?
So the first thing to keep in mind is, let's compare it to Venezuela, because it's not that they're the same place, but it's a useful comparison. In Venezuela, you had Hugo Chavez, who was the guy who took over in the late 1990s, and his bus driver eventually became his protege, and that is Nicolas Maduro. And over the process of the Chavez-Maduro era, the business elites of the country were purged and they went into exile. The military was turned from an independent pillar into basically a paid stooge. They got into drug trafficking a little bit. Rule of law broke down. Even the technical people who kept the oil industry running went away. And so you basically had this shrinking cadre that started looting everything, including things that were literally nailed down. They would rip up industrial facilities and then sell them for scrap to get the cash. And by the time we got to a year ago, the entire elite of what was left in Venezuela is like a dozen people, of which Maduro was in charge. So when you removed Maduro, there wasn't a deep bench to kind of fill the gap. And at the moment, the U.S. is continuing to interface with that same group of cronies and criminals, but they realize that they could be the next one person removed, and they're being somewhat cooperative. Trump thought he could apply that model to Iran. Take out the top guy, you're done. The problem is that the political class in Iran are the imams, the Shia clerics, and that's over 10,000 people. So, you're not talking like a bad flu season or a mild assassination campaign that can purge that. But within 10,000 people, you're going to have factions who see different things different ways, whether that's the role of Iran, the role of the United States, corruption, energy, whatever it happens to be. So it kind of is split into three chunks. You've got your political leadership, which includes the president, who are primarily responsible for the day-to-day operations of government, keeping the trains on time, handling documentation, making sure the lights are on. You got your second group, which is your security cadres, which includes the supreme leader, the defense minister, the intel chief. Those are the ones, the second group are the ones that the assassination program that the U.S. and Israel is carrying out have been targeting most directly, because they are the ones who are responsible for the foreign security policy that involves terrorism and sectarian groups across the Middle East. The third group is the IRGC. And these are the guys who carry the day-to-day intimidation of the population to make sure that nobody gets too uppity. And this is a minimum of 250,000 people. If you include their adjuncts, you're probably talking closer to 400,000 to 500,000 people. And they are self-funding. They run the smuggling networks. They run half of the power network. In a country that is under sanctions that still has to import everything, they handle the import in order to get the political control from distribution. And they handle oil exports. So now that we're in this scenario where the Persian Gulf is closed for business unless you're Iran, and the IRGC has now set up a toll system. So if you want to get in and out, you have to come to an Iranian port in the northern Gulf, pay your $2 million or whatever happens to be, get a permit, and then be escorted along the Iranian coastline all the way out. They get a cut of every single ship that's coming in and out. And because they don't care at all about sanctions anymore, they've actually been able to increase their oil exports. And the IRGC runs all of that. So their income has conservatively tripled. And the political leadership above them is somewhat tangled because of all the attacks. But they also are the ones who control the drones and the missile arsenals. So they're carrying out the war militarily, while the U.S. Navy is sitting back, while the economics that allow them to function are working just fine. So from a strategic point of view, Iran, the IRGC specifically, is actually in a better position now than it was 5 weeks ago.
It's important to break that down and understand that, because as you explain this to me, if Iran is now in a situation, or the people in power in Iran are now of the mindset that they need to complete the nuclear process and be an imminent threat, able to pull the trigger if they need to, that's going to require, to prevent that from happening, I believe, I'm paraphrasing you here, to prevent that from happening, that will take a continued bombardment of some kind, military disruption by the United States and allies in Iran.
Not military, economic. And in the last 24 years, in the last 24 hours, we've seen Israel and the United States switch to economic targets. We're now hitting pharmacy processing facilities. We're hitting steel mills. That's brand new, and that's designed to destroy the industrial base, because that's really the only way that you might be able to prevent the nuke from now happening. Okay. That's a different sort of war.
That's a different sort of war. So there's incentive from your perspective for the United States and maybe some allies to stay involved in economic or military operations or otherwise to prevent that process from being completed. There's also incentive from the IRGC to see this war continue because of the power grab that's occurring as a consequence, the income generation. They're more powerful today than they've ever been, and they're the ones who control the guns. In any dictatorship, you've got the leader, but whoever controls the guns really holds the cards, and you need that marriage. In this case, it's the IRGC, and their bank accounts are being juiced up. Everybody talks about, well, Iran might be running out of missiles soon. Well, not if they're not running out of cash. Would you agree with that?
Three things there. Number one, I don't want to overplay the IRGC making a power play. I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm not saying that won't happen. I'm saying we're not seeing that yet. Okay. There's no advantage at this moment for the IRGC to take formal control of the political system, because then you have to identify who's your defense minister, and they get bomb dropped on them. IRGC has a degree of separation from that specific aspect of the war right now. I don't see why they would disrupt that. That could change. Okay. What was the second piece?
Well,
sorry, too many things going on.
It seems like the IRGC has an incentive to keep the conflict going because they're benefiting from it at present, anyways. At
present, the attacks have targeted IRGC locations on many occasions, but there's just so many of them, and there's so many people. As for keeping the missiles going, that gets a little technical. A missile requires a truck that can handle a 50-ton load. trucks don't just come like that. You have to modify them, especially in a place like Iran. So that requires a significant amount of work. So taking out the missiles and the launchers is something the U.S. military has proven to be pretty good at. Haven't eliminated them, but have taken out quite a few. The drones, though. The drones, by volume, are half styrofoam and plywood, and you can assemble them in a garage. There is nothing that has happened so far that has meaningfully impacted the ability of Iran to make drones and dribs and drabs. Some of the big assembly factories, yes, those are gone now. But unless and until the Iranian ports are shut down, all the parts for these things come from China, and those ships are coming in just fine. So the IRGC is making more money. Their resupply line is completely unaffected. And so, of course, they're continuing to cook off munitions.
Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, recently came out and made a statement that the drone warfare that you just described, small kind of guerrilla-style drones that can be assembled in a garage, are as big of a revolution and innovation in warfare as when Genghis Khan put stirrups on saddles. Would you agree? And
I think it's much bigger than that. Not that stirrups were not a big deal. They were at the time.
Sure.
This is more akin to the Industrial Revolution changing the nature of war from the Crimean War and the U.S. Civil War. This is on that sort of scale. It's a deep democratization of the ability to deliver explosives at range. Even low-tech Shaheds have a range of 600 miles, which is more than enough to hit anything in the region. And being able to produce them from $30,000 to $60,000 a pop based on the model. You know, Iran pre-war was making 700 of these a week. They are now the nature of warfare. And one of the things the United States is going to discover if it does decide to do an amphibious landing is a ship that is launching the amphibious landing can't move because troops are coming and going. All of a sudden, it's a target for Shaheds, and they will hit it with everything they can.
How does the U.S. address that? Okay, so I want you to break down this dilemma a little bit more for me. So it's essentially a new but low-tech weaponry that is just difficult to deal with because of the abundance and agility of it. And we've got, the super tanker being the U.S. military is suddenly up against a bunch of jet skis, and the jet skis have machine guns, and this is a problem.
I don't know if I like that comparison, but I see what you're after. So Shaheds have something called a NAND chip, which is durable memory. It retains its data after it's shut down. And basically what you do is you program it like a cruise missile. So if you think back to the Tomahawks from the first Desert Storm War back in 1992, that was the first time this technology manifested. You have a NAND chip, you program in a route, you tell it what to hit. It's now been 30 years since then, and so the chip that did that is no longer cutting edge. Now it's something that any Chinese fab can kick out by the millions a day, and so it only holds maybe a gigabyte, if that, and you can just send it on and on and on. So it's not particularly high tech by today's standards, and this is a very, very low end drone. There's a wide variety of drones out there. This is this specific type, NAND. Okay, in that environment, anything within about 600 miles that is stationary is endlessly vulnerable because these drones don't even have sensors. They can't see where they're going. They can't dodge anything. Their strength is numbers and low cost. And so if you want to intercept them, our entire air defense system has been based on a completely different model where even though the Russian jets are cheaper than ours, they're still in the tens of millions of dollars. And so if you have an interceptor like the PAC-3, that's what comes out of the Patriot that costs $4 million against an $80 million MiG, the math works for you, and it's a question of technological superiority, which the U.S. has generally had. This changes that math. So you need to develop a different interceptor technology that doesn't invert the economics. Guns, maybe, but very, very limited range. And since the Shaheds are coming over the water, you don't detect them until they're within a few miles of the coast acoustically, and there's just not much time to react. Also, all the Gulf populations and all the Gulf infrastructure on the Arab side are right on the coast. So you have at most seconds for an interceptor to do something. And we don't have the technology for that at cost right now. The one country in the world that does is Ukraine. They have something that's called the Sting, which is a second-generation interceptor for them. It fits in a duffel bag. It has a cost of somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a pop, and they're in the process of starting mass manufacturing. However, Zelensky told Trump something he didn't know once, and Trump has held that against him ever since. And in Trump's own words, we don't fucking need Zelensky for anything. And so we now have Poland, Sweden, Finland, Romania, Germany, France, Britain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and I'm leaving someone else, Bahrain, all investing in Ukrainian physical infrastructure and industrial plant in order to mass produce things like the Sting because they can't get them from the United States. And the United States is completely on the outs of this new phase of the drone revolution. It's a very frustrating situation to watch that the willing ally who's serving our strategic interests by being in a war, Ukraine, is being completely shut out, and our entire alliance structure is moving on without us.
Recently, President Trump has said he is ready to withdraw or planning a withdrawal regardless of whether or not the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. What do you make of that claim?
I mean, he might. Everything that I'm hearing from the White House is that he is just bored of Iran right now and wants it to be over. But, wars don't work that way. And just because the U.S. decides to peace out doesn't mean that all of a sudden Iran's like, I'm going to be, oh yeah, totally fine. Yeah, we have no problem with that. There wasn't a plan going in aside from bombing them for the first week. Trump was literally surprised that the whole place didn't just dissolve in 7 days. And everything since then has been pure extemporaneous. Wow, that was a hard word. Extemporaneous. There we go.
Yeah. A lot of personalities in media are likening this scenario to the British Empire's Suez Canal moment in 1956. Do you see any parallels there? And would you mind expanding on what they're referring to when they say that, Peter?
Sure. So because of the World War, let me back way up. Britain was Britain. Britain was the British Empire for 150 years, ruling most of the world because it had industrialized and no one else had. So for 150 years, it was bringing guns to knife fights the world over and had no problem dominating everybody. This is why 30,000 British troops were able to dominate hundreds of millions of people in India for so long. If there was a conflict, you're talking about 1,000 to 1, 10,000 to 1 casualty ratios. They could pick the time and the place of the fight, and they brought a lethality that no one else could match. By the time you got to 1900, the Germans had industrialized, and they had defeated Denmark and Austria and even France. And all of a sudden, you had this continental industrial system facing an island industrial system. And that fight we basically know as the two world wars. And in those two world wars, Europe was demonstrated that it had more power than Britain did. And the only way the Brits won the war then was the United States getting involved, bringing in a whole other continent of industrialization into the fight, which meant that when World War II ended, Britain had lost, even though they were an ally. And the United States now was the global navy. So for the Brits, Suez was about the British Empire having a second wind, basically operating under the umbrella of U.S. security in order to try to rebuild its empire. And at Suez, the United States says, no. In fact, if you keep doing that, we're going to intervene against you. And that crushed Britain's empire for good and taught the Brits the lesson that never again will we ever be on the bad side of the Americans, because what we're able to do is a subset of that now. It was realism, frustrating as it was. The moment we're at right now is the United States is deliberately turning its allies into long-term competitors. So while it's not smart, I'm not sure it's a great comparison. What Trump has said in the last 48 hours is go to the Middle East, take the oil yourself, take control of what you want, because we're not going to do it. Part of the structure of what led us these last 80 years was in the aftermath of World War II. We said that we'll patrol the global ocean so any of you can trade with anyone if in exchange we can control your military policies. Suez is where that broke with the Brits, and they realized that they had no choice but to accept. And so for the last 80 years, yes, we've maintained a system that from an economic point of view might not be everything we want it to be. But from a security point of view, that didn't just let us win the Cold War. It meant if there ever was a fight, we took control of all of our allies' militaries directly. And I think that gets lost in today's discussion. If you want to move beyond globalization, that's fine. Have a conversation about that. But if you actively destroy it without a replacement, the basis for American military power in the entire Eastern Hemisphere dissolves. Because without the Allies, we don't have the projection capability. And we're now in a situation where we have threatened allies with invasion over Greenland. We've destroyed the ability of the Persian Gulf to function in a way that provides energy to the Eastern Hemisphere, which is going to cause a protracted energy shock that will probably generate an energy-induced depression in Europe and East Asia. And now we're saying we want you all to rearm and take care of your own economic needs. So instead of having all of your militaries under us, they're all going to be independent. That is a perfect recipe for a catastrophic and honestly unprecedented reduction in national power. The only thing that even comes close is a Soviet collapse. And the scale of the decline we're about to see is going to be a lot bigger because the Soviet Union wasn't a global empire. It was a regional empire, and it lost Central Europe, and that hurt it in immense ways. But it's not like it had global basing arrangements and global power projection. We're now talking about unwinding the entire military structure that has allowed us to dictate global events since 1945. And that is going to come at the same time we're generating competitors out of allies. And we're never all going to see eye to eye on everything all the time, which means instead of us facing something like a China threat, we're going to have a British threat, and a French threat, and a Korean threat, and a Taiwanese threat, and a Japanese threat. And there is no country in human history that could manage all of those. And this is something we are deliberately creating.
And when you say something we are deliberately creating, would you pull that back to how we opened this conversation with this is a policy driven by one man's instincts, or
Yes.
is there still a bigger picture here?
It's one man's instincts. I mean, it's really difficult to find anyone in the military complex who's like, oh yeah, allies, we don't need those.
Mm-hmm. Are there not some checks and balances in a democracy that could sway, prevent, redirect some of this, Peter?
We're going through a bit of a political moment right now. Every generation or two, the factions that make up the parties move around, and it's normal. Changes in demographics, geopolitics, economic trends, tech, and we've been through a lot in the last 40 years, and so we're now managing our system differently. And that means the coalitions that make up the parties, Republican and Democrat, right now are offline. Trump specifically, while he was out of power, ejected the national security conservatives, the fiscal conservatives, and the business conservatives from the Republican coalition whole scale. And so all that's left is that social conservative MAGA core that will basically do anything that Trump wants. And the Democrats are even in a bigger mess. So the normal check that Congress could be via the parties isn't in play, which makes Trump very, very consequential. And if the Congress is not willing to take actions, then there really are no functional restraints on presidential power except for the courts, and the courts take months to years. I mean, it took us, 11 months for the obviousness of the tariffs to be ruled unconstitutional, and now it's just being done by a different venue. It'll take another year before that is overturned. And when you're talking about security issues, of course the president is the only thing that matters. Now, we will be coming up in 3 weeks against the deadline of the War Powers Act. After 60 days, the president is supposed to come to Congress and get formal authorization to continue operations. At that point, it will be up to Congress to say yay or nay. And then it will be up to Trump to ignore them, because he will. And then it will be up to Congress again to try to overrule him. That will take a 2/3 majority. As weak as Congress is, I don't think that is possible. Trump still demands loyalty from more than enough Republican senators to make that not happen. So we're entering into an area that, in addition to the security crumbling, we're looking at a constitutional crisis in the not too distant future that I think is already preordained how it's going to turn out.
So you've spoken in the past and written a lot about, a new world order that is United States retracting within its borders into its continent, withdrawing from being the global policeman, protecting trade routes, keeping them secure, predictable, and flowing, and sort of call that the fracturing of globalization or global power and predictability. But how aligned is this it's not completely unaligned with that, but where do these two things diverge? And if you could expand on that a little bit for me, that'd be great.
Right. Globalization was designed for a different age. So the idea that it was eventually going to break, for me, that was obvious. And the idea that the United States was going to lose interest in patrolling the global systems, also obvious. There are 1,000 ways that this could have been carried out. We're doing it in a way that is most damaging to our long-term interests. That is something I would really not prefer. I would prefer that we would keep select allies on board to be, first and foremost, say, the United Kingdom. And today, relations with the UK are the worst that they have been since the Civil War. So it's like there's a lot of really low-hanging fruit in security talks for countries that desperately want to be on your side and are willing to bleed for you. And those seem to be the ones that Donald Trump is most offended by. Denmark's at the top of that list. They suffered much more in Afghanistan per capita than we did. And the only reason they were there was because of us.
Some of the biggest funders of some of America's biggest equities, mainly the biggest AI companies, that cash has come from the GCC countries. And a lot of new agreements and investment promises made by the Saudis and UAE and Qatar into the American economy. I would make the assumption those are fairly compromised now after their cash flow has been cut off. And not just that, but the Strait of Hormuz is obviously a two-way street. Oil goes out, GCC food comes in, 80% of these countries' food is imported. So if your cash flow is shut off and you're trending towards food security, 60% of their water is treated in desalination plants that haven't been aggressively attacked yet, but they have been attacked to a degree. This region strikes me as incredibly unstable. And in addition, I think 56% of the entire GCC population are foreign nationals, meaning they have somewhere else they can go, and like 92% of Dubai, for example, some of the bigger cities are way higher than that. And so you're facing maybe this like four-pronged crisis, which is, yes, energy export, therefore cash flow, but food and water security, and then maybe eventually human resources, because if you're getting bombed, that's tough. But if you're getting bombed and you run out of food, that's way tougher. What's your take on that, Peter?
Let's start with the second part. We'll end with AI. There's nothing on the Arab side of the Persian Gulf that is sustainable in a long-term war scenario. Nothing. If you lose the power grid, you lose the desalination. If you lose the desalination, the population drops by half within a matter of weeks. That's before you have a chance to starve to death. You just boil to dust in the desert. And unless and until there's some sort of arrangement between these countries on one side and Iran on the other, this was never a viable long-term situation. These countries only date back to the 70s. That's when they got their independence. And they've lived their entire existence since then under a degree of American strategic cover. And that was all because of globalization. We maintain global security so that trade can happen. And one of the trades that happens is oil from the Persian Gulf to Germany and Japan and all the rest. If that is really over, then yeah, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arabs, Emirates, Bahrain are dead. They can't maintain 1/10 of their population without globalization. Saudi Arabia is only in a little bit better position because most of the population is in the West, and it actually does reign somewhat in the West, but you're still talking about a significantly different power structure. Keep in mind, if we get to that point, and at the moment, that is the direction we're headed towards. Iran doesn't get a play either. Iran won't die, it won't go away, but it certainly won't be able to export oil. All our facilities are focused on Karg Island. That's where it all gets exported, and it would be really easy to take out if we get to that point. That's probably where we're going to be within a few weeks to months. What the region looks like after. Iran doesn't go away. It's still energy self-sufficient. It's going to have a population adjustment. It imports food too. But in a post-Gulf scenario, its security environment looks very, very different. And most of its primary competitors are gone. So then we have an issue between Iran and Turkey specifically. The Turks will win that long term, but long term is measured decades, maybe over a century. The Turks are just a much more stable power. As for your AI question, and what's kind of underlying at the petrodollar idea, if you are the Arab states and your primary security guarantor came in and just wrecked your entire economic and security model, obviously you're going to move some money around. And if your ability to import or export crude drops significantly, and for most of these we're looking at zero, for some of them we're already at zero, then there's not going to be fresh investments coming in. I don't think that is what's going to be a real problem for U.S. markets. There just aren't a lot of deep liquid options out there. There's really no place else to put the money right now. But they might move it into assets that are a little bit more problematic for the White House. So fewer T-bills, maybe investment into states or something. There's a lot of ways you can play that. For AI specifically, we're obviously in a bubble. 40% of industrial construction spending is data centers. That's just batshit. The key thing to remember about that is that high-end semiconductors, most notably the graphics processing units that are the core of any AI data center, they're the most sophisticated manufacturing processes that humans have ever developed, and they require globalization. So we're not going to be able to make those chips much longer. That won't obviate the data centers that are already in operation, but they will be the last of their kind.
Okay. So GCC potentially the first to be hit the hardest, and broad implication could be that 50% of the population disappears, relocates, and there's a utter collapse in what is otherwise there's not a lot there. You need the trade.
You're probably talking closer to 80%.
80%.
Because when you're talking on the eastern coast, specifically Kuwait, UAE, and Qatar, those are places where 2/3 of the population are import.
Are foreign nationals, right?
Yeah, exactly. And whether they're the Instagram class that lives in Dubai, or the financiers, or the people who actually do the day-to-day work, without the money, there's nothing there for them.
Does Dubai reclaim their brand somehow as the peaceful oasis in the tough neighborhood?
I've always thought that the very concept of Dubai was stupid. And we're watching it die real time. That's like one of my few non-regrets of this world.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So second order implications, I would think after the GCC nations are hit as hard as they might be, it would be the island economies like Japan, Australia, Taiwan. Anybody who's reliant on imported cheap energy will be the next to fall, next to be hit.
Sure. The final tankers of LNG and crude from the Persian Gulf that are not Iranian are arriving in Europe and Northeast Asia right now. So a week from today's the 1st of April, we should see some really crazy activity in energy markets, especially with prices, because now all of a sudden it's no longer a theory. We've missed over 300 million barrels per day of exports already, probably closer to 350, and this week is the week that actually starts hitting individual countries. So we already know that Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines are already on the edge of rationing if they're not already. Within the next week, we're going to have similar price pressure in China, Japan, Korea, Italy, and Spain. Greece is already there. And then in the next week, basically the rest of both regions. Keep in mind that Europe imports the EU imports roughly 90% of its crude, and Russia at the moment is not an option. East Asia, the overall percentage might be a little lower, but it's really concentrated in a few places, and is much more energy intensive than the Europeans are. And the Europeans have natural gas options that the East Asians don't have. The United States can fill some of that gap, but you're talking like a quarter of it, and that's it. The country I am most concerned with mid-term is China, because while they're still getting a trickle from Iran, 2 million barrels a day, that's down from like the 10 million barrels a day they imported from the broader region. And the United States is not going to favor China in supplies. Countries like Japan can tap the Western Hemisphere to a certain degree, but Korea is a little bit more of a concern. And as a rule, the wind and solar potential, forgets installed capacity, but potential in East Asia is really low. So like the Chinese have installed fields and fields of wind turbines and solar panels, but they don't generate much per panel or per turbine, and they just can't replace what they're losing from China. Their solution will probably be a degree of coal, which is a pro or a con based on your math. The second order effect from China is China has far more refining capacity than it needs, and so it's been exporting things like diesel and gasoline, which don't show up in the normal trade figures when people start talking about energy dependence. But we're going to have a second order effect from that throughout the entire Pacific Rim that we're also not very ready for.
So within 2 to 3 weeks, you expect EU and at least East Asia to be facing significant energy crises, right? Walk me through. So China also has very deep reserves, right?
They've got cash.
They've got cash, right? They've got significant oil reserves too, no? And I think a longer runway than most.
Well, a few things to keep in mind about China. Number one, it's the most inefficient economy in the world. That includes energy inefficiency. So there is maybe a lot of low-hanging fruit for that to be improved, but that low inefficiency is basically them just shoving inputs in their manufacturing system. And if they become more efficient, that's going to cost more, and then they lose their price advantage in manufacturing in a time when we're already in a trade war. So I think their flexibility there is a lot less than most people think. Second, they do have oil reserves, not as much as they need per in terms of import cover as, say, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, or the Japanese do. But they do have them. The thing to keep in mind, though, is they're really, really stupid about it. So when the Japanese or the Americans have an energy reserve, they do one of two things. They refine it into finished product. They store that specific product near the point of consumption. So it's right there. Or, in the case of the United States with crude oil, we hollow out a salt dome and we fill it with crude oil, and the natural geology, the temperature gradient, keeps it circulating so the crude doesn't cause a problem. The Chinese just put massive vats of crude there, static, and so it starts to separate. And they've never had to tap these things. And the reason we don't do that in the United States is it becomes explosive very, very quickly, not to mention you get different layers of different crude grades then as it separates. So they might, on paper, have some good reserve numbers, but in practice, I'm really not sure about how that's going to work. The only point of comparison I have is when they tried the same thing with corn, and they just stored it in massive long piles along roads, and within 12 months, it just rotted away to nothing, and their entire corn reserve was gone. I don't think it'll be quite that bad with crude, but to think that a country that has never had a reserve and has a bad record of building reserves is going to be able to skate through this, I think that's a bit of a stretch. Also keep in mind that April 1st is the 11th day in a row that the Ukrainians have sent at least several dozen drones, sometimes several hundred drones, into the Baltic Sea to take out Russian energy infrastructure. And the major facilities there, primarily Ust-Luga and Primorsk, are now functionally destroyed. That's at least 1/3 of Russian oil exports that now have nowhere to go. The Russians really can't maneuver things within their own system. So that was almost all going to China. So China, the whole world, is getting a double blow where they're losing Middle Eastern crude and Russian crude at the same time.
And as a result, Peter, every single, especially powerful economy, but every single economy has a dog in this fight. Therefore, you could be led to believe that somehow this will get resolved if you're in the EU, you're China, you're the GCC countries, you're in East Asia. Look, we didn't start this fight, but we are massively impacted by it, and we need to get to a resolution here. And I think this morning the UAE said they will involve themselves militarily if that's what it takes.
Yeah, they immediately rescinded that statement.
Did they?
Yeah, they say they were misquoted.
Because they were hit right afterwards, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Let's say you want to militarily intervene against Iran in this situation. The question is capacity. The whole idea of globalization is the United States controls military policy. No one else has a global military posture. That's our job. And in a fight, we control your regional forces, which means fast forward today, there are only 3 countries aside from the United States that can even bring military force to bear here. And it's not nearly as much as the U.S. has already brought to bear combined. So you've got Japan, you've got Britain, you've got France, and that's it. I mean, if you remember back for the last 15 years, the Saudis and the Emiratis were involved in a war in Yemen that they couldn't resolve. They eventually just gave up. And that's freaking Yemen. Iran has a population 3 times the size of Texas. It's twice the size of Texas. It's a much harder nut to crack. No one but the U.S. can really even get into this fight. So for Trump to have started the war and now saying it's your problem, he's basically demanding that they all build up independent military capacities that we don't control in order to project power on a global basis. There's no version of that that works out well for us long term. And in the short term for this fight, it just doesn't apply.
Let me ask you, I find myself often wondering, we've been head faked so many times in the last decades about a situation that might occur, especially with the current American president. He's very bombastic, likes to make big announcements and then often walk them back, right? And so there's a bit of like precedent that's been set there, and it's easy to look at this situation and see, I wouldn't be shocked if tomorrow we wake up and the Americans have withdrawn and the Strait's open in a week. I don't know how that's going to happen, but there's a bit of programming just from previous.
Fair.
Okay, so, but when I walk through this in detail and you look at just the second and third and fourth order implications, we're fracturing the supply of minerals, of fertilizers, of plastics. And even if you're a country that's rich in resources, you're now fractured from your industrial base, right? The United States, it might be rich in resources, but they don't make anything, right? So you've got Mexico and Canada there. You need the global supply chains to still function, or inevitably you're facing massive shortages of most things. And I feel like right now, Peter, therefore, are we standing on the precipice? Like, is this April 2020 where we're like, oh, in 2 weeks, this will be over, right? It's not going to be anything big. And, in a month or two, we'll be back to normal life. We had no idea what was coming, right? Most people. I didn't. I feel like we might be on one of those precipices right now where in 8 months, 12 months, we'll be looking back at today being like, if we had only known what was going to happen. What's your take, Peter?
Well, let's start by saying that every national security and foreign affairs professional, save one that worked with Trump his first term, actively campaigned against him for his second term because they knew he had no idea and had no interest in learning. So the idea that none of us saw this coming is silly. Everyone in his inner circle saw this coming. So that's piece one. Piece two, let's talk about what's kind of inevitable at this point. Because this Persian Gulf is closed, Kuwait has shut down 70% of their oil production. Iraq has shut down 75%. Qatar has shut down 100%. The Emirates have shut down half. Saudis have shut down about 1/3. In the best case scenario, where the war ends tomorrow and Israel says, you're right, we should all get along, let's sing kumbaya, in that specific scenario, we don't get back to normal oil production pre-war levels until 2028. So we have until then to stretch out the disruption. These fields don't come back on in 3 months or 6 months. In most cases, you're talking years, especially when you're talking about Iraq. That's a lot of time to suck it up. The fertilizer stuff is hardwired in. The liquefied natural gas facility, Ras Laffan in Qatar, it's already 1/4 destroyed, not just damaged. So we're talking about having tens of billions, probably well over $100 billion of repair work needs to be done before we can start talking about some of this stuff eventually coming back onto how it was. That's more than enough time for a global energy recession. That breaks a lot of the manufacturing ties that bind across the East Asian rim, and it shatters a lot of the economics of agriculture on a global basis as long as these things are integrated, where you use inputs from one region, process in another region, application in a third region. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we have a continental economy. We're the world's largest producer and exporter of agricultural goods. We're the world's largest producer of energy. We're the world's second largest exporter of energy products. We actually exported over 5 million barrels a day of refined product last year, which is a world record on top of our crude oil exports. So if we've got a world that is in a degree of shortage and the United States is in a degree of surplus, as long as there is a globalized market, the prices will equalize. And I don't care who the American president is. If crude on a global basis is over $150 or $200, the United States president is going to do something about that. And based on laws that were passed 11 years ago during the Obama administration, if the president wants to, he can sign a pen or sign a document and end American energy exports. He doesn't need Congress for that. He doesn't need a review period. So our most likely scenario by the end of this year, even in a peace scenario, is that the United States, or excuse me, the world loses Russian crude, American crude, and Persian Gulf crude more or less at the same time. That will break everything in the Eastern Hemisphere. And of course, if the war continues on, so there's more physical destruction done to the energy assets in the Persian Gulf, that just happens sooner and harder.
So GCC, energy export, already with damage completed, probably offline for at least 2 years, best case scenario.
Yeah.
Russia not far behind because the Ukrainians are completing similar attacks on Russian energy infrastructure.
Well, there's 3 export avenues for Russian crude: the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Pacific Rim. The Pacific Rim, obviously, the Ukrainians can't hit. There's no immediate reason to think that that is in danger. But the Baltic Sea is already offline. It's not coming back. The Black Sea, it gets a little more complicated because the Trump administration has specifically warned Ukraine to not hit that infrastructure, the export infrastructure, because there's a couple of American-involved projects in Kazakhstan that use it for exports. So what I would expect is once the Ukrainians are done with the Baltic, they will move to other parts of Russia and hit all the pipeline junctions and leave that one alone. That'll still take at least another million, maybe $2 million or million barrels a day of Russian crude offline, but not all of it.
It's a dire picture.
Yeah. And this is just the opener. This is just the energy side of this. We now get to go through this for finance and for agriculture and for manufacturing.
What's the finance implications?
We got a couple of big things going on. Number one, when the baby boomers really hit retirement en masse, remember almost 90% of them are retired now. They liquidated their savings and went into low velocity investments, and that's driven up the cost of capital on a global basis already. It's independent of any sort of policy. But now we have a situation where, because of the energy crisis, people might not like the United States for any number of completely legitimate reasons. But the bottom line is the US dollar is the only thing that trades at scale. And in a world that is breaking down, the US is affected the least. Our big weakness is manufacturing capacity. We need to double the size of our industrial plant. We don't have anywhere near enough time to do that anymore. But the process of building it out is a growth story on top of the fact that the US doesn't face a food or an energy crisis. So regardless of what people would prefer, there's really nowhere for the money to go but the United States. So we get a moderate growth scenario, not strong growth, because we have the most hostile business environment in my lifetime under this administration right now. Nobody knows what the rules of the game are. So moderate growth, high inflation here, and everyone else, stagflation is probably the best that you can hope for. Cash doesn't like hanging out where there's stagflation.
So one of the narratives behind the Suez Canal parallel is that this was the real moment when global central banks saw the United Kingdom was no longer the powerful force it had been. And for 150 years, that precedent had been set. So even though their industrial base and their balance sheet were destroyed after World War II, on paper, they did win the war. And so you're a central bank. Why would you diversify away from pound sterling at that moment? Inertia is a real thing.
Absolutely.
After the Suez Canal, the world saw, oh, wait a minute, the United Kingdom can no longer act on their own free will. They need permission from this new power, the United States. And that's when you see central bank treasuries globally begin to sway in a meaningful way away from pound sterling and towards US dollars. And so, some of the conversations around this parallel are that the United States is in another war that it can't see its way out of, and some kind of withdrawal might occur, and there might be a narrative spun at home that victory, we won, and here's how and why, and the American public will buy it and believe it, as similar to decimating the nuclear infrastructure 6 months ago. But the rest of the world will know what really happened. And the question, though, is in the Suez moment, there was another home for that capital, right? The US dollar existed. They had financed the Second World War for the Allies. And so there was a legitimate alternative. Today, there isn't really one. And so regardless of how wrecked or reputation-wise the United States is damaged, you kind of mentioned this, there at present isn't somewhere else for that capital to go. And so regardless of this, you don't see that part shifting right now.
Let's dial it back and figure out how the Brits got to where they were. So when the Brits developed the combined deep water navigation with industrialization, their navy was more powerful than everybody else combined. They were able to build trade links throughout the world. That was the basis of the empire's economic backbone. As part of that process, the pound became very, very important, and the Brits happened to discover a lot of gold deposits, so it was all backed by gold. So you had a hard asset-backed currency with global reach enforced at the point of a gun on a global basis. Of course, the pound dominated. But then the world wars happened, and the Brits had to pay for everything. And by the time we get to the start, not the end, the start of World War II, all the gold was gone. It was all in the United States. And by the time we get to the end of World War I, the US dollar was actually in bigger circulation already than the pound. So at the end of World War II, it's the dollar, and that's it. And so when Suez happened, yes, there was a break. You're right. Inertia is real. The pound remained the global standard until Suez, and then it all went to the United States. Now, the United States ran the system. Bretton Woods was not just about security. It was also about finance. And we set a fixed price for gold, which was probably not the smartest thing. And lots of countries forced us to cash that gold in based on their economic policies, with France being at the top of that list. So we get to 1973. And the gold standard breaks because we have now experienced economic growth that has increased the size of global GDP by a factor of 6. And there just isn't enough gold to carry that sort of trade. So we move to the fiat era. And in the fiat era, it's all about depth, liquidity, reliability. And say what you will about Trump, he's damaged all of those things, but not to the point that it's anywhere close to any possible competitor. The second largest currency in the world is the euro. The euro was already having problems before this conflict, and it had basically constricted to just being a regional currency. Now they're looking at a protracted crisis of every possible flavor, and the idea that the euro lasts, I think, is a bit of a stretch. The next one down is the pound. Nobody wants the pound again, because if you're going to be in a world of fiat, you're certainly not going to go with the smaller currency. The next one down is Canada. And, the Canadians run a pretty tight fiscal ship, but they can't manage the system. The Chinese yuan is completely locked in its own system. Its circulation is actually bigger than the United States because everything that the gold bugs accuse the U.S. Fed of doing, the Chinese have actually done for the last 20 years, and they just inflate their money supply to pay for things. So the debt situation in the United States is very real. It's very unattractive. It's nothing compared to the Chinese debt situation. So yeah, there's nowhere to go. And if you want to go into hard assets, every single one of those is denominated in US dollars.
Is there a pattern in history where when we enter these global conflicts, generally those who come out on top at the end of it were those who controlled the industrial bases? Would that be a true or a fair assessment? And could that tell us anything about today, Peter?
It's a combination of industrial assets, insulation, and the ability to project military power. And the United States, for now, holds most of the cards in that game. The Chinese might have more industrial plant, but they can't project power through the first island chain, all of which are deathly opposed to China. So this is a country without allies that also is dependent on globalization. That's not a good combo for the moment that we're in. The European Union has a lot of industrial plant, but it's aged to the point that it has to export to keep the system going. That requires globalization. And the only country that is the large consumer market that's relatively proximate is the United States. And I think regardless of whether Trump was president, we're kind of done absorbing the world's exports. That comes at a security cost that we have not fully thought through. And, we'll change our mind over the next 25 years as we deal with the fallout of this. But we have the option of changing our mind over 25 years, whereas everyone else is looking at a much more determined systemic break over the next few.
What do you think happens in the next American election? I mean, as you mentioned early in this conversation, the Democrats and the Republicans are, to a degree, completely offline at this moment.
Yeah. So Democrats are simpler. God knows. After Biden, they have no leader. They have no platform. They have no agreement on anything. That could be anything. They're going to have a completely chaotic primary. I have no idea how that's going to go. So who knows? Newsom does well on TV, and the second he's in a conversation, it all falls apart. But the same thing happens for Trump, so who knows? Trump will try to run for a third term if he's alive. And if he's dead, God. He's like, anyone who tries to take over MAGA has to have Trump's slavish approval. And that means they cannot run as an independent candidate. So the only way we get a MAGA Mark II is if Trump says, this is the guy, he'll make the best president ever, second best, and we get to, like, say, July of election year, and then Trump dies, so he doesn't have to so that the candidate doesn't have to keep going back to Trump and look like a toady. It's the only way MAGA gets a second version. The Republican Party, broken. There's nothing from the national security community. There's nothing from the business community. So we need both parties to restructure and rearrange and reform. Maybe a third party comes in as part of this. There's a lot of ways it could go. But the idea that process will even be partially completed before our next federal election, I think is overly optimistic. So we're going to have a full cycle of utter chaos, and I'm not really looking forward to that. So ironically, the next 3 years of having Trump in charge looks great to me compared to where we're about to be.
Interesting. And maybe, is there some promise there in that the American two-party political system needs to be destroyed and rebuilt? And maybe this is
we've done it before. This will be our sixth political realignment. So the idea that the Democrats and the Republicans in their current form are forever is silly. They didn't really start to form like they are now until the 80s. And if you really want to get back to the core rearrangement that set us on this path, you have to go back to the 1930s.
Okay. Right. That would be okay. Look, Peter, it's been a pleasure having you on. I really enjoy picking your brain, and the breadth of your knowledge and the depth of your knowledge is incredibly impressive. Thank you for making the time, and I look forward to doing it again.
All right. Until next time.